Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Everybody, welcome to The Tom Woods Show, episode 2524 with Peter St. Onge, who was a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and all-around great guy. His Twitter feed is indispensable. He makes short, easily digestible videos talking about things nobody will tell you about the economy. And I have to explain myself here. It's been however many episodes since we've started doing video on this thing. And I normally have this trademark blue blazer that I keep right by the chair here. And it's just too darn hot in my office. I just get out of the shower, and it is too hot up here to put that jacket on. So maybe I'll sneak it on as the air conditioning, because I don't put the air conditioning on up here if I'm not up here. So now I'm up here, and it's too darn hot. So Peter, welcome to the show. This is none of your concern. Welcome to the show.
No, this is absolutely. We're both here in Florida. So yes, heat is always a concern. Sometimes you wake up and you're like, God damn, it's sunny again. The facts of life living in Florida.
Yeah, who saw that coming, right? Another sunny day. So, all right, let's actually dig in to a video you just released because it got quite a bit of traction out there. And it has to, I don't want to give it away because it is such a shocking figure or series of figures about the percentage of the income tax receipts that are, well, now I'm ruining it. So you tell us about it.
All right. No, you were almost there. Yes, 76% of personal income taxes paid last month went to interest on the debt, right? That's not debt. I mean, of course, our deficit is much, much bigger than that. So in other words, 3 out of every $4 that you're currently writing the IRS is going straight out the back door to Wall Street and to China.
That's incredible. I mean, I bet if you asked the man on the street,
yeah,
what do you think that figure is? It wouldn't be 76% that you'd get as a response.
Yeah, people have no idea what's happening. And, you see that in polling. This is a common complaint among fiscal conservatives is that, something like the student loan bailout, which was a roughly $1 trillion handout, at least, if he keeps going. And you talk to voters and they don't really care. That was $1 trillion of their dollars that just went out the door. They don't care. You talk about the, deficits now are on track towards $2 trillion. Again, there's almost no interest in that among regular people. And what makes that interesting is that it begs the question, do voters ever think we're going to pay this off? Like, what do voters know that, let's say, bond investors don't know about U.S. debt? Right? Maybe the voters are correct that there is no way that's ever going to be paid off. That then raises interesting questions. Maybe anybody who buys government debt is buying something where they're going to be rug pulled. That thing ain't going to be paid back.
Well, what it also shows is something that I keep saying, which is that because nobody cares, I mean, they just don't. They don't care about spending. They don't care about the debt. They don't care about these extraordinary figures that you're mentioning. They don't care about the deficit. They don't care about budgetary issues, really, because they've grown accustomed to the idea that somehow it all gets paid. Somehow the wheels keep turning. Like, don't ask me to explain how it works, but that seems more or less to work, and I have other fish to fry.
Yep.
So sometimes I'll hear things like, oh, this new Republican Party under Trump just doesn't care about fiscal responsibility anymore. But they never did. That's the thing. Like, that's a very, very sweet and quaint thing to say about the pre-Trump Republican Party. I mean, it moves me, really, my heart. But before the Trump version, you would get the occasional pretty speech and the occasional wringing of hands about the situation, and then it would just go on. So I think it's a myth that it was ever really different. And it's certainly a myth. In fact, I don't know if anybody even believes it enough for it to be called a myth, that there is a constituency out there that's really concerned about this. And so because of that, I feel like, well, if you're going to evaluate candidates, maybe spending is just not, you don't have to worry about it because no one cares. I mean, you're not going to get a better candidate on spending because even when they sound like they're better, it's like J.D. Vance on foreign policy. I want to stop sending the money to Ukraine so I can send it to Taiwan or whatever. I mean,
right.
Okay. Fine.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it's structural. Once you remove the external constraints, right? Once you run through, Wilson, FDR, Nixon, by the time you're done with that process, if there's no external constraints, then every election becomes a competition between one guy who's promising to throw a gigantic party and give everybody free stuff, and another guy who's promising, we're going to eat vegetables, we're going to pay for the last parties, right? No parties for you people. So who is going to win, right? It's almost like, back in high school when you've got some, election for student president or something. And, if the one guy is going to throw a party and the other one is going to take away stuff, who do you think is going to win? So in a sense, you not only are both parties pro-spending at this point, as you say, always have been, they always will be once you remove those external constraints, right, of hard money or alternatively of default. Like if our government gets to the point where people are no longer buying the bonds, the so-called bond vigilante strike, that would be an external constraint. We could have some sort of balanced budget mechanism, which has been talked about in Washington for a long time. But unless you have that external constraint, both of the parties will always push for more spending because otherwise they're just going to lose the election.
Well, I'm flabbergasted that we're in this situation. I remember as a kid in the 80s thinking that there was some plausible pathway to, I was an abnormal kid to be worried about things like this, but to, having sensible people on both sides get together and sort this all out, and I think, oh my gosh, I mean, it's what you want when you're a kid, you want to think like that.
Right.
It's not, I don't reproach myself for that, but now that I'm well into adulthood, it's frustrating and demoralizing. And of course, this goes to show why it's, as you said in your recent video, the restoration of sound money, that is to say, anchoring the money to something like gold, or, you gave other examples, but let's say gold, is so off the table.
Right.
Now, the official reason that we're given that it's off the table is that it's economically unsound and it causes depressions and we need a certain amount of inflation to keep the economy going. And so we elites who care deeply about your well-being would never allow you to fall back into a monetary error like sound money. No. Okay, the real reason is it makes the gravy train much, much, much harder to run. That's the reason. It has nothing to do with them caring about you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was fundamentally the problem with gold, right? Is that FDR could not launch his, what do we call it? Corporatist, I guess is the word that we're supposed to use. His corporatist takeover of the economy in the 1960s, 1970s, the whole guns and butter with the Great Society and the permanent wars at the same time, the guns and butter. None of that could have happened under the gold standard, and that is why they fight it tooth and nail. They will fight the gold standard harder than really anything else out there, exactly as you say, because it takes away the gravy train.
So that's unfortunately where we are, but this is why it's important for people like you, when talking about the economy, not simply to overlook the root of the problem. Which, like for example, the Ron Paul just wrote a piece on the Republican Party platform ignoring the actual cause of inflation. I mean, you can complain about government spending till you're blue in the face, but that's not really that's not the thing that's fueling price inflation. So somebody has to talk about this. Somebody has to convey it to anybody who is still conscious enough to be listening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, both parties try to hide what's causing the inflation, right? So the Democrats want to put it on, Vladimir Putin, too many people, at one point, too many people buying Peloton cycles was what Psaki blamed over in the White House. Okay, so people were just buying too much. The economy is just doing too well is actually standard explanation. So the Democrats try to grab these external explanations. The Republicans are a little bit better, but they're just going to try to pin it on whatever Democrats are doing. So they'll put it on regulation, which is true. They'll put it on policies of the Biden administration, maybe illegal immigrants driving up housing costs. Okay, all of those are true. But as you say, they are missing the elephant in the room, right? Almost the entirety of the inflation is being driven fundamentally by government spending. The Fed then has to come in and finance that spending because it knows who pays its bills. It knows who the boss is over in Congress and in the White House. So fundamentally, the spending is pushing it. The Republicans don't want to talk about that because they don't want to cut spending. They've got plenty of ideas of what we can spend that money on, starting with Ukraine, Taiwan. Really, at this point, our military has sort of little venture investments in almost every country in the world. Nigeria, Colombia, Philippines, everything in between. They're talking about putting up Arctic bases now because we have to counter the Chinese and the Russians. I'm like, why? But anyway, they have these little venture investments. And just like any venture capitalist, every so often, most of them don't work out. They don't manage to start a war. But every so often, one of them does. And good Lord, man, $300 billion for Ukraine. You imagine what the profit margins on that is. So that's where we are, right? Is that the Democrats want to hide all the causes of inflation. The Republicans are talking about some of them, but neither of them want to talk about the spending. If we don't cut the spending, then the inflation will not end. It'll just keep running. We might get a reduced period of inflation as the economy slows over the next 18 months, but long-term prospects are much more inflation.
Well, isn't there there are forecasts. I care more about our people's forecasts, but like Jamie Dimon and people like that.
Yep.
What are they all saying?
Yeah, well, that was funny. That was a video last week that we had warnings from both JP Morgan and Citibank, which are two of the biggest banks in the country. And they were actually warning with different things. So JP Morgan is saying that inflation is going to keep running for longer. He says, therefore, interest rates are going to be higher for longer. That's gumming up everything, right? It's, companies are running out of money. The housing market is completely stuck. People are locked into homes that they don't want to be in. Young families can't buy homes. So they're saying inflation is going to keep running. Citibank, meanwhile, is warning of another catastrophe, which is that they think that we're going to have panic rate cuts, right? That the Fed is going to jump in and it's going to start cutting every single meeting all the way through next July. That's interesting because that's what happens when the economy careens into a recession, right? In normal times, the Fed tweaks a little bit up, a little bit down. When it's run into this nonstop parade of cuts, that normally means something broke, right? They are panic cuts. So if you put those two together, we've got inflation, according to JP Morgan, and then we've got stagnation or a recession coming from Citibank. It's not looking good, right? It's looking like a repeat of the 1970s catastrophe. At that point, the interesting question is, right, so we had stagflation in the 1970s. It ran for something like 8 years. It was a very long running. It was a terrible time. American cities were dystopias. And it was finally ended when Paulvulker, Fed chair, he came in, he jacked rates up to, I think it was about 19% that he got rates up to. And that finally ended it. The problem is we can't do that this time, right? There's two reasons we can't do that. One of them is that Paulvulker's boss, Jimmy Carter, lost his job, and Washington is not that dumb, right? They're not going to take one for the team again this time. And number two, the debt is so much larger than it was in the 1970s. You might actually know the numbers, but it's probably on the scale of probably about 30 times bigger than what it was back then, the federal debt. They cannot sustain. If you tried to do tomorrow, right, just for argument's sake, if you tried to do 19% interest rates on the federal debt, that would be $7 trillion. It can't be done. So that's my concern, is that we are following the 1970s script. If they fall into that again, I don't see how you get out.
Hey, everybody, you and I talk a lot about parallel institutions, and we expect the market to devise alternatives to things we don't like. Well, there is a market solution to some things we don't like. As you know, increasingly Google and Microsoft, Apple, Zoom, the tech bros running big tech today think your private data is their playground for their advertising networks and AI systems. Well, one way you can avoid all those things is not using the quote-unquote free tools big tech wants you to use. Well, Federated Computer is the market solution. They offer a full replacement for Google, Microsoft Office 365, Slack, Zoom, all the tools of big tech, but designed for people who care about privacy, don't want to be treated like cattle, and are looking for a great price. Everything's encrypted end-to-end, fully backed up daily. We're talking about private email, file storage, group chat, WordPress, all the applications you need for your business or team, all bundled into one easy monthly subscription that's 10 times less expensive than big tech offerings. You get unlimited users, fantastic personal customer support from real human beings, and the assurance that your data is your data and not big tech's. So visit www.federated.computer for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS for 10% off your first 6 months. So how about that? A company that thinks its job is to provide you with services you're looking for a great price rather than spying on you or shutting you up or manipulating you. Well, join other happy Woods listeners by taking your first step towards digital freedom. Visit www.federated.computer today for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS for 10% off your first 6 months. Yeah, that's been my concern, is that the prospects of a Paulvulker are basically zero.
Yeah.
And isn't that odd that they would be zero at a time when people, or at least more people than ever, kind of understand monetary issues, thanks to Ron Paul? Like, we have more people talking critically about the Fed than ever. And yet, with more people aware of the situation than ever, it's never been less likely that somebody will come along and actually turn the screws. And, the thing is, we all know that the Fed is not as, quote, independent as it makes itself out to be.
Right.
But it is more independent, let's say, than your local congressman. Like, if it wants to do something unpopular, it can do it.
Right.
So it would be possible for somebody with some sense to do the sort of right thing. It's just no one will do it.
Yeah. Right. The political incentives in Washington are to keep kicking the can. I think the founding fathers understood this as part of the reason why they gave such a limited role to government in the economy, is that the incentives are to keep kicking the can until the crisis comes. And then you get the uniparty who joins hands and agrees that nobody could have possibly seen it coming, like in 2008. And, the only way you can head that off, like, we were talking earlier, you need some sort of external constraint, hard money, also, a much more limited role for the government. If the Supreme Court woke up tomorrow and realized that there's a 10th Amendment in the Constitution which limits the federal government, then maybe we could get back towards that. But if you look at the incentives on both the spending and on the money printing, they are to, just keep driving that train off the cliff and then deal with the consequences.
Yeah. Well, now we have to think about what's going to happen in November. So, first of all, I initially thought, Trump got shot at. He's got a tremendous reservoir of goodwill that he hadn't had before. And Biden was a confused mess. And it just looked like, it wasn't hard to tell how that was going to go, even though Trump has every disadvantage in the world and the other side has every advantage in the world. Then they replace Biden with Kamala, who, remember, had to drop out of the primaries very early. Like, no one ever voted for her in the primaries. And somehow they're making her seem kind of popular and chic and hip, and everyone's hopping on board. I don't think you can write her off, even though I'm as aware as anyone of what a disaster she is. I don't think you can write her off.
Yeah, the media, what we saw during COVID is that the media has an incredible ability to polish a turd. And when you throw in the accumulated power of big tech, right? Google can control search results. They can demote, they can promote. Almost every social media platform out there is, of course, run by a rabid left-winger. Their ability to take something like Kamala off the pile and just shine that up until Americans, especially low information voters, they're susceptible to this stuff. I think we absolutely have to take her seriously, as unserious a person as she is. And, if you look at the betting markets, really at this point, you can't trust polls, right? The polls are so thoroughly engineered and manipulated, but you can't look at the betting markets. And of course, the betting markets include the margin of cheating. Betting markets could be manipulated, granting that. But nonetheless, if you look at the numbers on the betting markets before the shooting, I think Trump was at about 63, in the wake of the shooting, he was about 63% odds of victory. At this point, he's fluctuating between 57-59%. He's still a favorite, but the betting markets are saying that Kamala is a serious contender. She is far stronger than Biden. I mean, Biden was almost a punchline. Kamala is a punchline, but the difference here is that the media is absolutely going full in. They're promoting this image of her as like Captain America, and I mean, it's comical to watch. Let's see, Bloomberg had an article the other day where they were just, I mean, it was a tongue bath. They were going on about she looks all the part, the leader of the free world, and I mean, they are deploying it. And unfortunately, there's about a third of voters in the middle who don't know any better, right? A third of voters are going to vote for it anyway, just because, they don't like right-wingers. A third of the other voters know what's happening. They would never vote for her. But that convincible middle, I think, is absolutely up for grabs. Republicans have to emphasize the ground game. They have to be, very engaged in media, putting out our own narratives, because I do think it's a much more competitive race now.
Well, what do we know? By the way, you know what? I feel naked without my jacket. I'm going to put it on while you give your answer. But I think we kind of know where she's coming from. But since it's you do this for a living, what can you tell? I mean, we know she's far to the left, but what?
Yeah, so she is a red diaper baby, meaning that her parents were communists. Her father is a development economist, which is the most communist portion of economics. He was a Marxist professor, so she was raised with this stuff. While she was in the Senate, she advocated across the board for every left-wing pet project you could think of. She was rated by GovTrack, which is a nonpartisan outfit. They rated her as the most liberal, meaning left-wing, member of Congress. That would be to the left, in the Senate. That would be to the left of Bernie Sanders, certainly substantially to the left of Joe Biden. Joe Biden was actually a centrist in the Democratic Party, believe it or not. The policies that she has talked about, she did run against Biden for a minute there, and she scored 1.5% of the vote. So apparently America does not like her. But at any rate, during that, she, helpfully explained some of her positions. So compared to Biden, Biden has banned fracking on government lands. Kamala wants to ban fracking on all lands. On taxes, Joe Biden has said that he wants to get rid of Trump's tax cuts, but only for people making over $400,000. Kamala wants to get rid of them lock, stock, and barrel. She's argued the entire tax cuts should be abandoned so the government can spend more. She's endorsed positions like 80% income tax, abolishing ICE, what used to be called Border Patrol. She has essentially, she was doing a bailout fund for rioters during the BLM riots. So just across the board, there's absolutely nothing in her history that is remotely centrist, unlike Biden. So she is significantly to the left of him. I think in a normal election, she would have never won. She's way too extreme in a normal Democratic nomination. She would have never won. She's too extreme. I think the one clever thing that Biden did was choosing an insurance policy, and now we're stuck with that. And so at that point, the question is, does the gaslighting industrial complex have enough power in it to lift this person over the finish line?
Well, I guess time's going to tell on that. I wish we had a sharp ideological divide between the candidates, at least on economics. I mean, we have some, but I have a feeling that she's not very bright, but she at least knows her instincts are society and the economy need to be managed by experts.
Right.
That she knows.
Yep.
She knows that particular constituencies need to get a bigger piece of the pie, which means redistribution, or that way of thinking. She's for DEI. Now, I guess the Republican ticket is against those things, but you could easily see Trump saying, "Oh, maybe I favor this program or that program." So the problem too is that because he doesn't have a consistent worldview, it's hard to really make a good contrast with her and say, "Here's what my vision is. Here's what happens when you don't try to manage the economy, or here's what happens." When you don't have a a series of experts, quote unquote, telling us what interest rates ought to be. I mean, what we have is she wants to do a whole lot of things and he wants to do a small number of things. But there's no reason that you'd want, I mean, as soon as you start saying, well, sure, we should have such and such government program, or yeah, the Heritage Foundation is too conservative, then there's no real principled reason to favor any or not favor anything other than just how you feel about it. I don't know if I'm expressing myself the right way about this.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes Trump relatively unique for a Republican politician is that he, rather than having some sort of kind of ideological view of the world, I think that Trump has in his mind a picture of who his people are. You do this in marketing. Okay, if you're marketing a product, in your mind's eye, you think, okay, who am I talking to? What kind of person is watching this video? Okay, and you think, what are they interested in, right? What kind of language, and so on. And I think that Trump instinctively has that marketer's view of the world, and that's paired with, when he was president and since then, his instincts have been to ask himself, what do my people want? And he goes for that, right? So if you take something, for example, when he went and spoke at the Libertarian conference, his comments on Bitcoin, he does things where he identifies in his mind's eye a particular group who he feels like either they are his people or they could be his people, and then he starts thinking, okay, what do they want? And there's no sort of economic coherence to it per se. He's just trying to do things that will make his people happy. In a sense, that's what Democrats have been doing for 100 years, right? If you look at how the Democrats have gutted, say, the city of Baltimore or Detroit, right? They weren't actually helping those people, right? What they were doing was trying to come up with narratives that they thought would appeal to the voters in those places. They've been very, very successful at it. They managed to destroy an awful lot of cities at this point and continue getting votes from the victims, which is pretty impressive. But anyway, I sort of see Trump as that kind of, he's driven by his people and he will do what he thinks his people want. That's very frustrating if you're, let's say, a free market economist or an Austrian economist, because, for example, he's flirting with unions at the moment, right? Because he's thinking that his people rely on unions against big business. He is, I think, not going to be ideologically or economically coherent. He tends to lean towards smaller government, but I think that's because he thinks his people lean towards a smaller, less intrusive government. If that ever changed, then I think he would change with it.
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Yeah, it's interesting that he's endured more than you could ever imagine a candidate enduring. Like somebody took a shot at him. He's been in all these ridiculous court cases that have nothing but political motivations behind them. He's been smeared and lied about. Crazy, wild stories have been invented about him and about his being a secret agent and all this and that. You would think you would want to get in there and absolutely start slashing and burning.
Right.
But I don't have that feeling from him. That's not the vibe I'm getting. It's not quite that. Now, it may be he's extremely adept at this and he's keeping his desire for revenge under wraps so as not to turn off the electorate. I don't know. It seems like I fear that a second Trump term would just be, like slightly right of center in terms of what he winds up doing. I would love to be proven wrong, but I don't really get he wants some tariffs. I understand that. He wants fewer wars, but also more wars. I don't exactly know what does he want to do? What's going to be different about this next time? I'm told that he's going to spend more than 3 minutes figuring out which people he ought to surround himself with. But other than that, what is the stirring vision that he's going to hold up for me? And it's pretty vague to me. And I do not rule out the possibility that he's done this and I've just missed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in his first term, he had a strong vision, right? So, building the wall, renegotiating trade agreements, tariffs, right? So being more forceful on trade, which, by the way, would put the U.S. closer to the EU. Okay, the European Union is a massive trade bully. They will club you over the head. They essentially sell access. Like, you have to pay them billions of dollars to access their market. It's just amazing that they're considered free trade. But, Trump's sort of trade aggressiveness would just put the U.S. in line with the EU. We wouldn't even be nearly as aggressive as China is. So, I think there's some logic to being a little bit more assertive in trade. But anyway, you have the trade. You've got the immigration. He sort of had a general program reducing taxes, of course, reducing regulations. I think, honestly, it was a really strong program the first time around. And I don't think he's tweaked very much to it. He continues to brag about not starting wars, which encourages me because I'd like him to remember that that's why people like him, because he didn't start wars. Mainly what he's pushing at this point is that, we're going to do it again. We're going to double down. And what you say, I agree, is the big question is the first time around, I think he got played by Washington. He did not understand how brutal and evil these people are. He was undermined across the board, including by people that he hired himself. I hope that he'll be a lot more, less naive about that kind of thing. But at the same time, he does have that instinct to please a broad base. If you take the love letter with the North Korean leader, that I think is his instinct. He loves the idea of taking a former enemy and turning them into a friend. And
I wonder why he won't apply that in the case of Iran. There were murmurings in his first term that he wanted to just sit down with the Iranian leadership and talk to them. But now, because his opinions are formed by the last person who talked to him, because he almost seems like he boasts. He doesn't, but it's almost like he boasts about not reading. So he's a mile wide and an inch deep. And so if somebody comes along to him and says, "Oh no, you absolutely can't do that," then he absolutely can't do that. But that would be a bold diplomat, because I think the rest of the world at this point views it as borderline psychotic. The U.S. fixation with Iran. I mean, the rest of the world knows that, like all regimes, it has its bad aspects, but this is blown absurdly out of proportion. This is not our enemy. Absolutely not our enemy. There's no reason we should be still fixated on this country.
Well, this is the amazing thing is none of the countries who are pitched as our enemies, we don't have a beef with any of them. We don't have a beef with China.
That? Isn't that something?
It's completely bizarre. For example, you take the Ukraine war, and the main Republican talking point is that we're going to bleed out Russia. And I'm sitting here like, why? Why are we bleeding out Russia? I don't get it.
Yeah.
As near as I can tell, Russia is an important ally in fighting international terrorism. Why are we bleeding them out? It's the same story with China, right? We're going to do a war of attrition with China. Why? I don't get it. The Arctic thing, right? So China wants to drill oil in the Arctic, which is a wonderful thing here for humanity because it would lower oil prices and would bring a lot more oil into the market. So I think that's a wonderful idea. But no, we have to build bases to prevent them from doing it. I don't exactly get why all of these countries are our enemies in the first place. And I think it goes back to that venture capital. They are putting little investments in 192 countries in the world and hoping that some of them can blossom into a war or military contractors. And it is horrific to think that, a couple of companies, I mean, we could take them or leave them. They're not a significant part of our economy. Yet I think that they are the tail that wags the dog.
Give me, before we depart, tell me one more thing that you've been making videos about, that because you have a very interesting approach here. Like, you don't do like when you're on Twitter, which I still call it that. You don't do like half an hour videos or an hour or a 3-hour Joe Rogan style interview. You do these 3 to 4 minute bite-sized videos, and that seems to be working well for you.
Yeah, it was sheer accident. Let's see, about a year and a half ago, my wife asked me why the banks are crashing. I told her, then she said, okay, do it again, and I'll put it up on Twitter. And it was a horrible video. I looked ridiculous. We didn't have any equipment, but it was 3.5 minutes. And we thought, okay, good. That's short enough that people can't get bored. So anyway, that is what I do. And let's see, I do them 5 times a week, so every weekday. And at first I was like, I'm going to run out of topics, but amazingly, the world just keeps getting crazier and crazier. So some recent topics, you've got a lot going on with the so-called de-dollarization, right? Where you've got companies dumping dollars. That's interesting because we were talking earlier about these $2 trillion deficits and about the bond vigilantes, or about people no longer buying US debt. And at this point, the largest overseas buyers of US debt, they're all getting rid of it. So China sold off 1/3 of its US debt in the past 5 years. Japan is now going through a fire sale. They're dumping it from their banks and their pension funds because the Japanese yen is so weak that their dollar assets have basically grown to take over everything. So they're getting rid of them. Saudi Arabia is even diversifying out of it. There's an article just today talking about Africa. All these countries in Africa, traditionally, they would hold all of their government or central bank assets in US dollars because that was considered the safe bet. But now that's changing, and it's changing partly because the US idiotically moved to seize Russia's central bank dollars. Okay, those were the sovereign dollars that converted the US dollar from good as gold, something solid to base your economy on, into a risky asset for any country that might anticipate any kind of political problems in future with the US. So all these African countries, which economically, they're the future in many ways. These are fast-growing countries. They're now growing fast economically. They're not buying dollars for their assets. They're buying hard assets like gold. They're buying local assets, or they're actually putting it directly into gold. So I think the next couple of years on de-dollarization, at the moment, we haven't seen any kind of drop in the dollar, and that's because we've had economic crisis, right? Whenever the global economy is doing bad, people go to the US dollar as a safe haven. But I think that's going to be a big story in the next couple of years, is the mass abandonment of the US dollar.
Let me end actually with this. I think part of the reason that people don't care about the debt or spending is they feel like people who have been concerned about these things have been crying wolf.
Yeah.
That nothing happens, so why do I care? And I think the same thing with fears about de-dollarization, because we've heard that years and years and years about this and that's going to happen to the dollar, and internationally we're going to see this turn away from it, but it never comes.
Right.
It just never comes.
Exactly.
So I think that is that's an issue that we have to confront, because remember the story of the boy who cried wolf.
Yep.
It's not just that the boy kept crying wolf and there was no wolf. The story ends with there actually being a wolf.
Exactly.
And so,
right.
This could actually be happening. Just the fact that it hasn't happened before, it doesn't obviously mean that it can't ever happen in the future. Maybe the wolf is here. But the problem is, I think a lot of people have grown cynical about these claims.
Right. Every time you put a brick on the camel's back, right? If you're sitting over there saying, this is going to get risky, people are going to laugh you out. And of course, many times in history, reserve currencies have collapsed. I think we've had about 5 regimes just in the past 500 years of reserve currency swapping out. You had Spain, you had France, you had England, you had the Dutch guilder back in the day. Reserve currencies can and do die. They die all the time. And, the problem is that every additional step that we take on this, especially on debt, brings that closer and closer. I think you're unlikely to see a true collapse until somebody else comes up with a better mousetrap, right? You got to beat
Yeah.
You can't beat the dollar with nothing, right? It's got to be something else. The other existing paper currencies in the world currently can't hack it. Certainly not the Chinese yuan. That's where I think the BRICS gold-backed currency is interesting. A lot of those African countries I was mentioning earlier are flirting with gold-backed currencies. They're African countries. People aren't going to believe them. But at some point, the notion of gold-backed currency is coming into the Overton window. It's coming into the political discussion. And that, I think, if we look at 35 trillion in debt, the unsustainable deficits, and there's an actual credible gold-backed currency out there, at that point, it's the end.
Well, let's hope that day comes, because actually, believe it or not, it would be a good thing to clear everything out and start on a sound foundation, honestly. Otherwise, we just stay on this treadmill forever, and it never gets better, and we keep every year suffering a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. And meanwhile, most of the population has no idea why they're suffering or what's causing it or where their purchasing power is going, but they're encouraged to place the blame on all the wrong people and forces. It'd be nice to just be done with that and start all over again, but we'll have to see when that glorious day comes. What would you recommend to people who want more Peter St. Onge?
I've got a website, peterstantonge.com, and I am very active on Twitter at PROFSTONGE at Prof St. Onge.
Okay, so and because we can maybe sort of see your neon sign, but they won't see the StreamYard name. So just so everybody knows, on Twitter, PROFSTONGE and peterstantonge.com, peterstonge.com. Peter, I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tal.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And don't forget, February to early March of 2025, the best event of the year is the Tom Woods Cruise. So go get yourself booked at tomwoodscruise.com, and I'll see you next time.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.